We are Irish Side of the Moon. Freedom of information, personal empowerment. The Irish Side of the Moon.
I still have a dream.
There are many sources of energy available.
Everything is energy. My God, do we need this or what? Free our mind.
Corporations have taken over the world.
Freedom of information, personal empowerment. The Irish Side of the Moon.
Hello, you're very welcome once again to the Irish Side of the Moon. This is interview number 84, and this is Michael at the microphone, Michael Leddy, bidding you welcome. Last week, Shane Harrison was at the microphone, and he was in conversation with Paul Grignon, a Canadian artist, filmmaker, responsible for the short animated documentary film Money as Debt and its sequels. Shane gravitates towards the financial shows, and I think they make great listening to. This one was no exception. 83 in our archives. You can check out the archives on iTunes, and you can check it out on the Irish Side of the Moon.blogspot.com blog as well. It's a handy place to go back through the shows and the topics that we have covered. So that was number 83. But that's old news. That's last week's news. This week's news, 84, I'm going to interview a lady by the name of Leslie Kane. This lady is an independent investigative journalist with a background in freelance writing and radio broadcasting. And she's responsible for a book that's available right now at all your good stores and Amazon.com, etc. The book is titled UFOs, and the subtitle is very important. It's Generals, Pilots, Government Officials Go on the Record. And that's the selling point of this particular book. By and large, most of the chapters are these people, the generals, the pilots, government officials, telling in their own words, writing the chapters themselves, their experiences with things maybe that they've seen hovering over airports, or in the case of people who have investigated things, writing about that, and it's people from all over the world. This, by all accounts, from what I can read of the reviews, etc., this is not a typical UFO book in the sense that it's probably aimed more at the mainstream, and it's done kind of in a more journalistic way. It doesn't seem as if this lady or her contributors are interested in theorizing about what might be going on. It really is kind of what it says, what it purports to be. It's just eyewitness accounts, first-hand viewers, and also people who have investigated about those investigations, things that have been seen, and it's getting a lot of praise in terms of it being a game changer, in terms of it being something different. UFOs, generals, pilots, government officials go on the records, and the lady behind it all, Leslie Kane. And I'm on the line now with Leslie Kane. Leslie, it's a genuine pleasure to bring you to the Irish Side of the Moon.
Michael, thanks so much. It's great to be here.
And before we jump into talking about the book, which is the main thing, UFOs is the title and all the stuff that goes with it, because you've got some very weighty people, may I say, some people with a lot of authority to write chapters and to give their stories. Before we deal with that, and that's going to be the main thrust of things, we always want to talk to our guests a little bit about their lives before and outside of the main message. And your own story is very interesting. You've been an investigative journalist for many years. Tell me a little bit about that. What was it in your formative years that lit the flame that made you think, right, journalism, investigations, that's what I want to do? When you were a little girl, were you reading Nancy Drew books and looking to investigate things? What was it? What set you on this path from the very beginning?
Well, that's a really good question, because I really, as a little girl, I certainly did read a lot, but I was never thought I would ever become a journalist. And really, it wasn't until later in my adult life that I did become a journalist. I'd sort of done various different things. I was actually a nature photographer for a while, and I worked at a university bird study laboratory in Ithaca, New York. So, and the reason the way I got involved with this was not so much. It was really as a human rights activist. What happened was I had
you've written about Burma and stuff. You've quite a body.
Burma,
yeah.
Yes, and that's how I became an investigative journalist, really, was because I became kind of on fire about the cause of the struggle for people in Burma for democracy. I had a close friend who had been over to Burma. This was in the late 80s, early 90s, and had been, very, very up close to the whole struggle over there. He'd been in the country as a monk for years, and not that much was known about it in the United States, about the terrible atrocities that were going on in that country, because it was quite removed from the rest of the world. And this friend and I started an organization called the Burma Project USA, and the purpose of it was to use journalism to bring out the issues that were going on in Burma, to make them better known to the world. And my friend had a fair amount of experience doing that, so I was sort of an assistant, and I really learned how to do it through working with people like him. I mean, that was the first. We spent many years, and got articles in lots of major publications, and I helped him write a book, and then eventually we co-authored a book about Burma. And it was sort of through doing it that I learned journalism. And then after working with the Burma issue for a while, I got a job working at KPFA Radio, which is a public radio station in California, working on a daily investigative news program there. And while doing that, I also did a lot of freelance publishing of stories about Burma with another journalist who had spent many, many, many years as an investigative reporter. He was a seasoned, award-winning reporter, and he kind of mentored me in those early years. We did a lot of articles together on Burma. One of them was a cover story for a major magazine in the United States, and it was really through working with this mentor that I learned the art of journalism, of what the criteria are for information, and how you judge the quality of the information, and how you construct a story, and all the things you need to know. So my heart and soul were always in it while I was learning it, and I think I just really loved being involved with that whole process of having these great experienced people take me under their wing and teach me. And then eventually I was also doing radio broadcasting, which is a different kind of journalism, but it's its own world of journalism involved there, and I learned a lot while working at KPFA Radio about how to do that aspect of it. And so it was very hands-on for me. And by the time the UFOs... Yeah, go ahead.
That's a great way to learn. I mean, learning by doing and being in the position where you have a mentor, again, a fantastic way to learn, experience. And then outside of even the Burma kind of storyline, I mean, having stories in Boston Globe, Philadelphia Inquirer, I'm just looking at the long list of credits you have. A lot of different stories outside of Burma must have appealed to you as well. I mean, what kind of story makes you go, I want to write about that, I want to investigate that? What appeals to you? Oh, gosh.
So many, Michael, because there are so many injustices in the world. I mean, one story that really got me going, besides Burma, I mean, I sort of transitioned away from Burma into a broader perspective when I started working at the radio station. I got very interested in the issue of wrongful convictions and the death penalty. Because I don't know about over there, but in the United States, there are many people who are convicted and sentenced to death here who are not guilty.
Yes.
And it's a terrible, terrible problem, and such injustice occurs. And then these people are released after 15 years when they discover, through DNA or something else, that they're innocent, and they're not given any support by the state. They're just sort of tossed out of the jails. I mean, the whole thing. And so that sort of became my focus. One of my focuses when I was working at KPFA was to interview these people who had been wrongfully convicted, and to interview the attorneys who were battling to get them freed. Became a real, and I did some stories about that as well, and I actually started to visit a prisoner in the Bay Area where I was living in San Francisco, who was at San Quentin prison, who could very well be innocent. He was convicted of murder, and so I was actually, again, it was very hands-on. I was actually involved with visiting him and getting to know him and learning about what his personal struggle was all about, and I was able to bring that into my reporting. So that was another issue that really, and still today, really inspires me, because the injustice is so black and white in that situation. There's so much corruption with the district attorneys, that the people who are convicting these guys, who aren't concerned about the truth, they're just concerned about getting a conviction, whatever means they need to do it.
Right, because they need that in their, they need that notch on their belt, as it were. I know there's the whole political system over there too, with regard to convictions and stuff like that. Okay.
Exactly. So, and then just the death penalty in itself, of course, is I'm totally opposed to it, and the corruption and the immorality involved with that is another issue too, related. But So that's, I'm always been interested in sort of social justice issues in which people are, wronged by the society, here and in other countries.
Okay, so we're building a picture. I mean, it's becoming evident, kind of the sort of journalism that you would be drawn to, the sort of stories, and sort of lady that you are yourself. It's obvious that this constitutes your body of work. Wherever you see an injustice, wherever you see something, I suppose, that's not being reported, it kind of interested you. Okay, let's start moving forward a little bit into the last decade or so. At some stage into this profile that we're building, something crossed your desk, or somebody said something with regard to the idea of UFOs, and something about it made you take it seriously. Maybe you hadn't had time or opportunity before. What was that all about? Where did that moment come from? What did you read, see, or hear that triggered a new chapter in your
Okay, I'll tell you about that. It does seem sort of like a leap to go from what I just said to UFOs.
Yes.
But that's what happened.
Yeah.
Back in 1999, I was busily doing my job at KPFA and covering the issues which I just kind of described, and then suddenly, unexpectedly, a colleague from France sent me this 90-page report, an advanced English translation of a French report that no other journalist had in the United States. And he said, "This is yours to do what you want with. No one else has got this. It's an exclusive." I looked at it, and it was a 90-page study written by a group of about 13 people, high-level military people. There were 4 generals among them, an admiral, the former head of the Space Study Center in NASA, which is the equivalent of our NASA in France, the equivalent of our NASA in France. I mean, scientists, engineers, very sophisticated people that had looked at the issue of the UFO because they were concerned about the possible defense implications of it. Basically, there were these objects that were reported that they were concerned about. And, I had read some books about UFOs over the years, off and on. I thought it was a fascinating issue, but I'd never really delved into it that much. But it wasn't like I knew nothing about it. But, to read a report written by people at that level about something as extraordinary as the possibility of objects coming here from elsewhere, really just piqued my interest and my curiosity. And the thing about the report was they had outlined some very, very important cases, all of which had been officially investigated cases, as well as did their own interviews with pilots and all kinds of stuff. And what really got to me as a journalist was their conclusion. I mean, this was what said to me, this is a story. And that was, these gentlemen, these admirals and generals and space experts, stated that after looking at certain cases which, were well documented and therefore could not be, they knew there was no explanation for them, they came to the conclusion that they thought the most rational, valid, and likely explanation for the phenomenon that they had studied in those cases was what they called the extraterrestrial hypothesis. They said that was, of all the possible explanations, that was the most likely one to explain these things. There was just no other way to explain them. They explored other possible options. That was the most rational one, and there wasn't.
Yeah, because this does not, from what you described, this does not sound like a group of people that you would expect would include that as a potential answer. Rather, these sound like people that would dismiss that. Exactly
right, and that's why it was so striking to me. It was only because of who these people were that wrote it. I mean, if somebody else had written it, it wouldn't have mattered. But it's exactly what you said, Michael, that these were generals speaking. These were people who are not fooling around with something that doesn't exist, who are not going to risk, their reputations unless they're really serious about what they're saying. And, I thought, my God, even if there's a small chance, just a small chance that these objects are extraterrestrial, it's worth exploring that. And I thought it was a really big story. I mean, I thought, oh my God, here we are dealing with the possibility that we're being visited from outer space. Now, that is a really huge story when you're a journalist,
yes,
to feel that there's actual potential in that, and it's not just, something that you just might sort of read out of curiosity, but here you have these high-level military people stating it. And so that's what changed my life, was that report.
Were you based, you had to sell this, obviously, to an editor, I'm presuming. Where were you at this stage in your career? And was it an easy sell? Were you able to go to an editor who immediately said, yeah, I see the potential in this, let's run with it?
I wish that had been the case, Michael, but no. I was, at that point, I was at KPFA Radio, the station that I'd worked at, for a number of years, and had covered the death penalty issues and lots of other things. Mm-hmm. And I was just, still working at that station, doing my daily news program. And while I was doing that, I got this report, and I started to really look into it. And I was very secretive about it, because at that time, there still is a lot of stigma around this, but it was worse then. And the people in my radio station, although we got along beautifully, they just did not take the subject seriously. So I was very cautious about even talking about it. And I spent about 6 months after receiving that report, looking into the subject, just verifying things, just getting more comfortable with the material. And I did start to pitch stories to editors. Now, these were editors that I had published with many times before, some of them, because I'd done a lot of freelance writing before, and they were extremely close to this. Even, I would try to pitch it without even mentioning the word UFO if I possibly could. But at that time, there was so much, it was just so taboo in the press, much more so than it is now, that it was very difficult for me to get my first story published. And the only reason I did was because the Boston Globe editor who published this piece that I eventually wrote on this French report and related issues to that, this editor had published like 5 or 6 other stories of mine, and some of them I'd written with my mentor journalist, some on my own, in this special Sunday section of the Boston Globe that she controlled. And she really liked the work that I had done before, and she really respected me as a journalist. So therefore, she was willing to take a look at the piece at least. But, it was touch and go. There were questions up to the very end whether she was even going to publish it. She did a lot of editing. She was very nervous about it, but she did it. And it turned out to be, in the spring of 2000, it was a long a news analysis kind of piece about this report and some other related information that I brought into it. And that was really a breakthrough for me to have that piece published. And it was only because of this editor and because I had a track record with her that it ever happened. It was not easy to make that happen.
Okay, so again, we're getting a picture of your biography, as it were, so to speak. And you took this leap, you saw this, you felt it was worth pursuing, and you did. Responses to it. You'd built up a career, you'd built up respect. Do you think, were there sections of the journalism community that no longer respected you because you made this story?
Well, I don't know. It's possible. They didn't necessarily tell me that, but definitely what my strategy was not to say anything about my interest in it until after I published the piece in the Globe. Right. And since the Globe is a very respectable paper in the United States, I think that gave me a leg up. Even the people in the journalism community, and a lot of them were people at my radio station who didn't take the subject seriously, and again, those that don't take it seriously, the only reason they don't is because they just don't know anything about it.
Yes.
But that's common.
Yes.
But the point is that, yes, the fact that the story was actually in the Boston Globe gave me sort of some credibility to stand behind in their eyes, so I don't think there was a complete rejection or anything like that. But I know that a lot of people at the station anyway certainly, don't take it seriously even today, regardless of all the work I've done. They just don't, and that's the way it is. But no, I kept working there, and it was not like there was any major backlash or anything like that.
Okay. Yeah.
But at least I had the confidence of that great newspaper, to to give me a leg up, and I published it in the Boston Globe, therefore it's got to be credible. At least I had that going for me. That's why I was very quiet about it before doing that.
Okay, we're bridging the gaps here. We've kind of pieced together the years before the UFO story came across your desk. Let's now look at the years since that. Okay, the book, which I haven't mentioned here directly, it's the subtitle is Generals, Pilots, and Government Officials Go on the Record. And the book is UFO, Generals, Pilots, and Government Officials Go on the Record. In the years between the story, which was the start of the whole thing, and the idea of putting together all of these different witness accounts, as it were, what were you doing? Were you continuing to cover the story? At what stage did you think to yourself, okay, nobody has put together all of these witness accounts as a book, nobody has done this, because really nobody has. What got you moving in that direction?
Okay, well, I'll give you the broad sweep, and then we can maybe go into more detail about something, because that's sort of big, broad overview. I mean, what I did, since the Boston Globe story, I pretty much focused 100% on this issue, and eventually left KPFA Radio and moved back to the East Coast. But I did a second story a while later about aviation safety issues as they related to UFOs, based on studies that have been done by a former NASA scientist, and I kept covering it, learning more and more and more, building up my resources, cultivating relationships with sources, studying them. There's a lot to learn when you're taking on a subject like this. And I kept publishing articles about it. At the same time, I co-founded a group called the Coalition for Freedom of Information. And I was invited by the Sci-Fi Channel, a cable channel here in the United States, to become involved in the Freedom of Information Act campaign to get access to information from the government about a UFO case that had never been released before. So that's a whole other side story we can talk about if you want. But basically that took many, many, many years of work with the Freedom of Information Act, with a team of people that I was working with, and we ended up filing a lawsuit against NASA and went to court to try to get documents released. And it was a long, interesting, but unfortunately not terribly rewarding in terms of the documents we got. But
certainly, we're more than happy to hear about that, because with all of the guests, we're always interested in the parallels, because we cover a wide variety of subject matter on the other side of the moon, but you'd be shocked at the number of parallels, because there's so many people like yourself or Stanton Friedman that are trying to get information from, like, the NASA or other organizations in that sphere. But the same thing happens when it comes to maybe cancer research, or the same thing happens when it comes to other topics. So yeah, definitely, right. I would love to hear anything when you want to go back onto that. It's definitely going to be of great interest to myself and our listeners. I can guarantee that from different feedback.
Okay, well, we can talk more about it. I'll just sort of take you forward a little bit, and then we can go into whatever you want. And then, while this issue, I don't think it was resolved in court until 2007, and then there were more documents that were released over the next year. I mean, it took a long, long time. And while that was going on, of course, I was still writing stories and covering things, and Governor Fife-Symington sort of came out of the closet at that point. He's a former Arizona governor, about his sighting, and I was the one that broke that story. So, between the Freedom of Information Act work and just my regular journalism on this, I was pretty busy. And then what happened was I co-organized in November of 2007 a filmmaker by the name of James Fox, who's made a very good documentary on UFOs, a couple of them, invited me to co-organize a press conference in Washington, in which we brought over a number of the high-level officials who actually have written chapters for my book. And he was making a film, and he wanted to have this press conference be part of it. And my job was basically to organize it and invite the people and get the people to agree to come and everything, and handle a lot of the organizational stuff, and help them write their statements and, plan the whole thing. We had this very successful press conference in the fall, which got a lot of media coverage. And it was at that point that I really got the idea about doing this book. You asked that question because, I realized that after many, many articles had been written, many documentaries, many TV coverage of our press conference, for instance, was massive, but it's just for a day or two, and then it's over, and nothing happens. And, the people at the press conference had like 3 or 4 minutes to make a statement. So I thought, I think people need to hear more from these people, these amazing generals who have had direct, official investigations or have witnessed things themselves. You can't get the whole picture in just a soundbite. And the sound bites have been going on for years, and nothing has really gotten through. So at that point, I sort of started to work on the concept of, putting together a book in which these people, in their own words, would write a much more expanded statement than what they could have ever done at a press conference. And I just sort of felt like, the only way I'm going to sort of get the issue through to people is if they're willing to read a book like that, because this issue of UFOs is such a complicated one, and it has so much stigma attached to it, that unless you're willing to read a substantial, bit of information, which is what I tried to distill into one book, my book, that, will do it for people, you're just not going to you're no way you're going to get the profundity, the complexity, and the fascination and the mystery that this and the reality of this phenomenon, of the whole issue. I mean, it just can't come through. So that was really the turning point for me in terms of the book. I wanted to create something where somebody only had to read this one thing, and they would really get that there is a serious phenomenon here, and it's a real mystery. And look at these high-level people who know that and who are involved. And that really, I thought, would have the potential to change things in a way that the sort of journalism so far, the films, the TV stuff, just hadn't been able to do. And so that was my intention in writing the book.
And I've been scanning through a lot of reviews of the book, and I'm seeing phrases in the reviews like, "This is a game changer," and "This is breaking new ground." So I mean, the perception, and certainly this book is aimed not at the UFO community at all, but certainly at the outside community. The perception is that it's working, because it seems as if you're getting the sort of attention and respect that any other books that have been written in the past, which might just simply be, and I don't mean this in an offensive way, but it could be just some farmer who was out in a field somewhere. I mean, I grew up on a farm, I'm a farmer, who saw something, but it doesn't carry the sort of weight. Whatever it is.
No, it doesn't carry the weight. Yeah, you're right. Of these high-level officials, such as 5 generals who have actually written chapters, and I think part of the power is that you're reading it directly from them. I'm not quoting you and telling you what General Jafari had to say when he was up in an aircraft trying to shoot down a UFO. He's telling you. He's written the chapter. You know, and that's a lot of the potency of it. And it is true that this book was not designed for the UFO community, and I think it really has broken through the barrier there in terms of, reaching the audience that I really wanted it to reach, and I've gotten a tremendous amount of great feedback. My goal ultimately is to affect U.S. government policy. That's a much harder job.
That's one of my questions.
That's a much harder job.
Yeah. Because I know that you do, I was going to say, like, what's your outcome? And your outcome, and you've stated this before, is, and you do have very valid concerns. And before we talk about the nitty-gritty of the book, which I do want to get into some of these witness statements, we'll do that maybe in the second half of the show. But you've mentioned the word safety a few minutes ago. And again, the very fact that even if we take the extraterrestrial explanation off the table, whatever it is, there is a safety concern, because in some of these situations you have an object which is unidentified because no military or government organization has laid claim or responsibility for it. So people are seeing it. It doesn't seem to belong to anybody, and it's affecting flight patterns. It's intersecting with jets. It's intersecting with hovering over an airport. In one case you've mentioned. So safety is a concern, and you very, very strongly believe that it should be a major part of policy in America, that something should be done about it. Yes.
I absolutely agree, and I think it's a very important point that it does. I mean, it does affect aviation safety. When aircraft are affected, they're actually physically affected by nearby objects. And as you said, the case at O'Hare Airport, which we can talk about more later if you want, with the thing hovering over it.
I would love to.
I mean, you have these objects in restricted airspace. They're completely, they don't respond to any kind of, they have no transponders or any way of communicating. They do whatever they want. We can't do anything about it. Yes, this is definitely a safety hazard. And so one of the approaches I'm taking, which, I think is a valid one, is to appeal to the authorities on that basis. Even just to have a reporting form for pilots through the FAA, in which they would, if they see something they can't explain, they could at least file a report on it. It would be a huge step. Now, I know in Europe they do it. They all, it's much more. Yes. You're way ahead of us.
In different countries, that was my next question. I have 2 questions leading off, and the first one is your experience. Tell us about the experience you find in Europe, in maybe South America, different parts of the world. They respond differently to what happens when a witness comes forward, like a pilot, and says, "I saw something weird today. This is what was going on. Check the radar, etc." They have a whole different way of dealing with it.
That's absolutely correct, and it's well ahead of the United States. I mean, first of all, the pilots in Europe are provided with reporting forms. I mean, that alone, you'd think, well, of course. No, in America, they're actually told not to report UFOs to the FAA, but to report them to the civilian research groups. I mean, not only are they not given a report, they're actually told, no, we don't want to hear about it. So just by the very fact that the Europeans have these reporting forms, and when they do report these objects, which any responsible pilot would do because it would be part of his duty, they're not, treated with ridicule and fearful of losing their jobs, at least certainly not to the extent that they are here. Mm-hmm. And a case in point is the 2007 case of Ray Bowyer, which happened right over the English Channel there, not far from where you are, which is the most recent case in my book, and he actually wrote a very entertaining chapter for the book about what happened to him, but he saw these gigantic objects over the English Channel, and his passengers saw them as well, and they were looking through binoculars, and they had a nice long look at them, and there they were just sitting there. He never felt that they were any kind of a safety hazard, but you never know.
No.
And as soon as he landed, this is on one of the Channel Islands, I think the island of Jersey, he immediately filed a report. It went right to the CAA, the Civil Aviation Authority, and to the Ministry of Defense. And, there was a study done. They acquired radar. They checked with, there was another pilot that was in a different location that also saw these things. So, everything was followed up on. This pilot did his duty, filed his report. He drew a sketch of the object. He described it. He said he didn't know what it was. And then he went on the BBC a few days later and did an interview about it, and it was all fine. The airline was fine with it. The airline gave him their full support. I mean, this just doesn't happen in the United States. It doesn't happen. When you have a case here, the pilots are told not to talk about it. They won't go on the media. They're afraid to lose their jobs if they do it. It's just a very different situation.
Is it possible, and I'm sure this has been mentioned to you before, but is it possible that in the US it does get investigated, but they will not go public with it? I mean, have you any evidence to indicate that they just like to keep people quiet in public, keep people quiet in the media, but maybe behind the scenes, ever since maybe Blue Book was shut down, maybe they really have been investigating, assuming that they don't know. Let's take that leap. Maybe behind the scenes, but they just don't want it to be known for some reason, because it's seen as a sign of weakness or vulnerability. So rather than admit in public, in private they're just investigating like crazy. Do you think?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I mean, certainly we have documentation since the close of Project Blue Book, which was in 1970, that government officials in the United States have investigated certain cases, especially overseas cases. Those are the ones that we've been able to get documentation for. In terms of the cases here that involve pilots, I mean, I have seen no evidence that there's a lot of investigation going on. Now, that doesn't mean there isn't, because if it's secret, I wouldn't know about it.
True.
But,
yeah, of course,
I have talked in the O'Hare case, which is the most recent one in 2006, where the object was hovering over the airport. I've talked to numerous witnesses there. I mean, they were never interviewed by anybody. There was no sign that any government official took any interest in the case at all. From any of the witnesses anyway, or from anybody, who's providing information. I mean, it doesn't seem to have happened. I think that, I don't quite understand it, because certainly they were very interested in lots of these cases overseas during the 80s, 70s, and 80s. But the FAA was entirely irresponsible in its response to this case in 2006, and I don't think that there is a lot. I think that our agencies are occupied with other things, and this just isn't high on the priority list. But
yeah,
I don't know what's. Of course, I don't know what's kept secret. So
of course, and that brings us nicely into what we alluded to, and I think it'll probably take us very nicely to the break we take at the halfway stage. You mentioned the dealings you had getting information from NASA. You mentioned that whole case. Let's go back there now before the break. Your experience of trying to get information from a government body or an official body, frustrating, to say the least. Could you tell us a little bit about those adventures?
Okay. Well, I mean, it's here's an example of just how sort of outrageous the whole thing is. When we first made our request, we made a request for information. This was about a crash, something that crashed in a little town called Kecksburg in Pennsylvania in 1965. Mm-hmm. And something landed. The military came, cordoned off the area, and then they hauled it away. And lots of people saw it at various stages of in the sky to crashing to all these different stages. And there was a physical object that was taken away. So that's basically what we were trying to get more information about, that specific case.
And it seems reasonable. I mean, when you have so many people and seen something at, as you say, different stages, it does seem in a free country like a fairly reasonable request that you would go after this information, particularly when you were a respected journalist.
Exactly, and especially when something happened that long ago. I mean, 1965, maybe at the time they wouldn't have wanted people to know. There might have been issues with dangerous radiation from the thing, or it might have been some kind of secret military thing that they needed to keep private, but after all these years, it's hard to imagine any rational reason for not being able to inform people what it was, right? So And by law, you see that they're required, after 25 years, to release documents. And the other thing is that if the documents are classified that you're requesting, they're supposed to tell you that. And they're supposed to say, these are classified, we can't release them for X, Y, or Z reasons. So anyway, to just sort of give you a quick example of kind of thing we were up against, when we first wrote to NASA, and we were asking for we had various words we used as search terms, for wanting him to search for various things related to this incident. I already had in my files some documents that had been released from NASA that were relevant to this case. So we asked for some terms that would have taken them to those same documents. So I knew they already had them. So we made the request, and they came back and told us they had nothing, no documents in response to our request. So I pulled my documents out of my file. We wrote them back and said, hey, buddies, you certainly do have these documents because here they are. You already released them a number of years ago. And, this is the kind of thing. I mean, the average citizen...
It's like something from a Perry Mason book. It's like the final chapter where the hero is able to pull something out and say, but this contradicts what you just said. Because
I know, and it's insane for them to say, no, we don't have them. Now, the average citizen is going to stop right there. I mean, who knows what, they have complete power to say what they want, and you're powerless on the other end. But in this situation, we had a law firm working with us and a public relations firm and all these, great power brokers that were provided by the Sci-Fi Channel. So we appealed that. We appealed their no records response by sending them back the documents that we knew they already had. And, of course, they had to agree that we won that appeal, and they promised to do this extensive search for us, on these various aspects of what we were looking for. And months and months and months went by. We heard absolutely nothing. 10 months we waited. And I think they're supposed to, by law, a couple of months. And then that was when we filed the lawsuit. And at that point, we filed the lawsuit. We had no choice. So that was sort of how it all started. And we had every reason to believe that NASA was on the scene because some of the witnesses reported seeing officials with NASA suits on. And secondly, because NASA was very actively involved at that time with collecting space debris. When anything fell from the sky, they were involved. And so, it was inconceivable that they had absolutely no records related to this case. We were convinced they did. It's hard to know sometimes where to ask. So there's so many different NASA branches. So, my attorney, who was very expert at this, they figured out the most likely places that these documents would be, and that's where we requested them to look. So it's possible that they're somewhere else, because we never got any documents on the Kecksburg case, although we got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages of documents, which they were forced to release through the courts. None of them told us anything about the case we were interested in.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we've spoken on the show. We've had Stanton Friedman has been on a couple of times. I spoke to him on one of those occasions. And again, so many parallels there with his own kind of quest. And the documents that he would get back with regard to maybe Roswell would be blanked out or would have just no information. Just no information. They would literally give a document and they would feel that legally they had fulfilled their obligation by providing a document, but there'd be nothing of any use.
Right, they black out 3/4 of the page, or something like that. It's very, very frustrating.
And before we go to the break, normally I leave these questions to the end, but a question leaps into mind now. I mean, you personally, when you're up against that much of a brick wall, and I'm assuming that you've had this throughout your entire career, that it's been in many stories you've dealt with down through the years. How, as a person yourself, I mean, this is like, what transferable skills can you tell us about? How do you deal with it? I mean, do you get up in the morning after, if the previous day was really frustrating? Is there ever a stage where you just think, I don't want to do this today? Or how do you get over that? What can you tell us, any of us who are doing something similar? How do you keep going when you think, I've been at this for, a month solid and every day, I can't do it for another month?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly have those moments, that's for sure. We all do. And, for me, it was also just the tedium. It was so tedious to look through so many, the selection process of telling them what documents, where to search. I mean, there was just endless amounts of very, very tedious, boring work involved with this. And yes, the frustration. And I don't know, I think with me, I just have such a strong kind of fighting spirit because I believe so deeply in what I'm doing. I'm so inspired to find the answers that always sort of carries me through the moments of despair and frustration, is that, I'm just very, very determined. And I know that there is something to this issue, and I consider it such a big issue. I mean, to me, it's a very big deal, the possibility that there are extraterrestrial vehicles flying around out there. And that's sort of, I always just had to revert back to the essential meaning of it all. You know, why am I doing this? What does this mean? What does this mean for the planet if indeed this is actually real? And what can we do to learn more about it? So I don't know. It was just something about the drive that I feel towards solving this mystery and coming to terms with it somehow kind of keeps me going through everything. I think also the people that I'm working with, I mean, I was not doing this lawsuit work by myself, although I had to do a lot of it by myself, but I did have a team of people who were extremely supportive and helpful, and, you know, it helps a lot to have colleagues doing it with you. And that's a big part of it.
Yeah, again, we've heard that from so many guests on Irish Side of the Moon, that like-minded people in your corner is a big thing. When you can share the pain and the frustration, it does go a long way. And I like your idea as well of kind of grounding yourself. You took in the perspective of the big picture, and kind of in that big picture your own frustration didn't seem quite as large because you knew that what you were doing was big. At this stage, we're going to take a short break. We're going to run to a quick message we play. Stay with us. We'll be back in just a moment, continuing to talk with Leslie Kean on the Irish Side of the Moon. Thank you.
You're listening to The Irish Side of the Moon. You can hear our new episodes every Monday on radiomedia.org and irishsideofthemoon.blogspot.com. You can also download episodes from iTunes, Stitcher, and many other sites. You can follow us on Twitter, you can join our Facebook group, and if you're already in the group, don't forget to invite your friends. If you have any ideas for future guests on the show, send an email to shane@theirishsideofthemoon.ie. We are Irish Side of the Moon. Freedom of information, personal empowerment.
Okay, you're back on the Irish Side of the Moon. I'm in conversation with Leslie Kean. We've been talking, Leslie, about your career really as a journalist. We've covered a lot of the different things, or a few of the different things you've worked on over the years. We've looked at how the UFO story first came across your desk and how you've dealt with that in the last 10 years. Let's talk about this book, UFOs, and the subtitle is Generals, Pilots and Government Officials Go on the Record. The website here I have in front of me, but I have the wrong tab open. UFOsontherecord.com is a good place to send people if they want to find out more about your work. We'll be telling people that at the end of the show again, and also it'll be up on our own website. The book, looking down through the list of contributors here, now the names are mostly not known to me, but again, following on from what we've been talking about, you've got flight calibration inspection pilot, you've got 20 years as a fighter pilot, somebody else, 30 years experience specializing in air traffic control is another person, captain and pilot for the Aviation Army of Chile is another one, lieutenant colonel assigned to RAF Bentwaters. We've got White House Chief of Staff to Bill Clinton. You've got a Republican governor of Arizona. The caliber of people that you put together. I know it's probably like asking somebody pick your favorite child. But talk to me about one or two of these chapters, one or two of these cases. What stands out to you as something that, I don't know, blew your mind when you first heard it, or you think is a particularly strong one? Anything leaps out, I would just love to hear you talk about it. Okay,
and of course, there's no way I can pick my favorite children here, but I can, we'll just pick a few here, and there's lots more. But, one case that I find particularly intriguing, and I actually opened up the book with it because it's just such an exciting case and so unusual, is the Belgian wave, which happened not far away from you guys in 89 and 90. And the chapter in the book, I read an introduction to it, but the chapter is actually written by a major general from Belgium who was a colonel at the time. He was in charge of the Air Force investigation into this wave of sightings. And what was so fascinating about this Belgian wave was that these triangular objects kept returning. Usually UFO sightings are a one-time event, but in Belgium, they kept returning over and over again to the Belgian for some reason, and they were seen by thousands of people, and many, many, many reports were filed. There was a team of scientists that worked in conjunction with the Air Force because the Air Force couldn't really do it all. And the scientists' job were to take the witness reports, to collect data, to interview people, to get drawings, to get, location data to map out trajectories of the objects and all the stuff that needed to be done. And it was a very good example of a scientific group working in conjunction with the government, which is, something that, Belgium really set a standard for how a country can responsibly respond to a UFO event, and I like that about it a lot. But I also like the fact that there is such compelling data about these objects. And, in the chapter, the general has included lots of drawings that were made by witnesses. There's just so much known about their behavior, what they looked like, because there were so many sightings of the objects. Police officers, the first night, there were hundreds of people that saw, there was at least 2 of them gliding around, and there were 13 police officers in 8 different locations that got very close-up looks at these very large triangles with these brilliant spotlights shining down. 2 policemen watched a kind of a red light ball come out of the center of the triangle and come down towards them. They were really frightened. This ball came out of this gigantic triangle, which was just hovering above them, and started sort of looking like it was searching for something. It was just sort of bouncing around, and then went back into the triangle. You read this and you can't quite believe that this happened, but it did. And here you have a major general being the one to present it. So it's like there's no saying, oh, this isn't true. This actually happened, and it's just I find it very compelling because of the repetition of the sightings, which allowed for just a lot more data to be collected than is often the case in these situations.
And
they also sent up F-16s to try to, that was a whole other thing. The Air Force sent F-16s up to try and get closer looks at the object. They took them very, very seriously, and they made a very strong effort to try to figure out what these things were that were continuously intruding into restricted airspace, and they were never able to figure it out.
And it is always fascinating too, because when so many different people see this, and it's from my perspective, I think it's got to be very hard for the debunkers and the skeptics. And I know that you yourself, you're very, you're skeptical in a professional way with regard to how you tell these stories. But it's very difficult to dismiss something like that when there's so many witnesses, and as you say, it was taken so seriously as well by the officials in terms of the police, the Air Force, etc. at the time.
Exactly right. And when you have a major general, who is puzzled to this day and is willing to lay out the information, it's like you just can't read his chapter and not be kind of blown away by it. And you realize who's writing this chapter. It's not some guy who just saw an object. This is a major general with a very, very impressive career behind him. Retired. So it's very compelling to read what he has to say.
And the contrast, on our show we've spoken to, and I always say this wrong, Lynn Katai spoke to us about the Phoenix Lights scenario, and I think you cover that as well, or it's covered by one of your contributors. And that's a slightly different take. I'll let you tell it, but it's a widespread thing. But am I right in thinking that the official response to it almost immediately was kind of to ridicule it a little bit and just to make light of it and dismiss it in almost a very insulting way?
Yeah, the Phoenix Lights incident, of course, was not in Europe, which tends to treat these things better. It was in Arizona back in 1997. It was more recent than the Belgian wave, and it was a one-time event, unlike Belgium. It took about an hour and a half, and as you said, it was a massive sighting. Lots, I like many hundreds is a conservative estimate of how many people saw it, these things gliding over the state of Arizona. They were delta-shaped, very, very large. Massive, massive objects. People describe them as, a mile long and things like that. And, so that's, that was, but the government response was basically nothing. They just, the tendency in America is to ignore, to not say anything unless they're absolutely pressed to. And if they're pressed to, they might come up with some bogus explanation to try to get rid of the whole thing. But in the Phoenix Lights case, Governor Fife-Symington at the time, who was the governor, made inquiries and tried to get some answers behind the scenes. He contacted the Air Force bases, and Senator McCain from Arizona actually wrote to the Air Force on behalf of some of his constituents to try to get information, and they couldn't get any information. Nobody just, the other officials in the state just said, we don't know what it was. And the federal government did not jump in at all. And here you have citizens, witnessing this gigantic thing flying over it, and they're just baffled that. I just recently was in Arizona because I've done a documentary when we covered this. I mean, these witnesses just can't believe that their government wouldn't care enough, wouldn't be concerned enough with this low-flying thing. That, you know, these one set of witnesses I talked to just came right over their house. It took about 5 minutes to glide over. How could the government not care and not be interested in something like that? It's just mind-boggling to the people who see it, and they, of course, don't feel like they're getting any protection or any answers. For those who might have been frightened by it, they're not getting any sense of being protected by anybody. So, and anyway, that's sort of the story of what happened. And the interesting component of that for me is particularly the story of Cy Symington as a person and what he went through then, and what he came out with 10 years later. And that's another story if we're just looking at the case. But so that's the Phoenix Lights is a very dramatic event, and it's got this whole interesting component of what happened with the governor and how he came out 10 years later and actually acknowledged that he himself had been a witness to the case, to the sighting.
That he had seen it himself, yeah. Again, I'll be asking you in a minute again about further cases from your book. Is there anything that didn't get into the book for any reason? Is there any story that it didn't? Maybe the person couldn't get it together in time, or maybe it just never panned out. Is there anything that just didn't work and you wish was in there for some reason, or is the book hoped?
I mean, there's certainly other cases that would have qualified for this sort of level. I mean, there are other really, really important cases that I couldn't include just in terms of the volume of the amount of space I had to work with. Mm-hmm. The only one that really didn't happen was I had a general from Russia who was going to write. He had some. I don't know that he's one of the ones I knew least about actually in terms of the people I had invited to contribute, but. I expected to have a lengthy correspondence with him and everything, and he just kept saying, yes, I'd be happy to contribute, but he never sent anything. So eventually, and I had to keep going back to the translator who was our intermediary and saying, I still haven't heard anything from him, and he would say, oh, yes, I want to do it, and then nothing came through. So I eventually had to let go of him as a contributor, but everybody else was pretty straightforward. I invited them to do it. They agreed. Most of them were people I knew already and had, they already trusted me and had worked with me and respected the way I approached the subject. So there was a lot of, they were very simpatico in terms of the way we looked at this, and they felt comfortable, writing for this particular book because of that. And it was very straightforward. I mean, it was, there were no snags with anybody. Some of them were difficult to work with because they didn't speak English.
That's what I was curious about. Yeah, I was thinking logistically, you're working geographically, you're working in a large area, but the modern world, the technology has rendered that kind of, even our show is put together in a few different countries. But language barriers had to, because I'm looking down the list of contributors here again. Yeah, you've got, again, Brazilian, you've got people, you've got people that probably English is not their first language, if it's even in their vocabulary, literally. So that must have been an issue.
That was a challenge, and I had to hire professional translators. For instance, the pilot from Peru, Oscar Santamaria, doesn't speak any English, but he speaks Spanish, which is a fairly easy language to get. And we just basically, I hired a translator and I did numerous interviews with him over the phone. We had a translator on the line to on-the-spot translations, and then he wrote his piece in Spanish. We had it translated, and then there's a lot of editing that goes on, and there was a lot of communication that I had with these people because some of them needed me to help them sort of draw them out. They don't naturally, an Air Force pilot doesn't naturally want to talk about how he was afraid or how he was feeling at particular times during his encounter. And my job was to sort of coax them to try to include more personal, to make the story as personal as possible, because I knew that would be of the most interest to people.
Yes.
And I had to make sure that, all the details that are needed were included. They wouldn't necessarily think to include certain, there might have been holes in their stories where there were questions that would come up, that the reader would obviously come up with, but he hadn't necessarily thought. So I would say, okay, well, could you fill in right here what happened X, Y, and Z after this? So I would sort of help them put the story together.
Any eyewitness, I'm sure you find, no matter what the story is, like an eyewitness to any event is going to need that kind of structure from you.
Exactly, and some of the writers tended to do that more easily than others. I mean, some needed more assistance than others. And it was particularly, when they didn't speak English and needed an assistance like that, that was a challenge. But it was very time consuming, and I had the great translators that I was working with, and you just do whatever it takes to get it done. And I think they all came up with absolutely fascinating stories, and a lot of them much more personal and revealing than they've ever been before publicly about what they went through, as they were going through these various situations. So I think that really adds a lot to their stories.
Of course, I mean that's what makes any story interesting when you get to
exactly.
know the person. Yeah. Okay, let's talk a little bit about this. The Chicago, wasn't it? The O'Hare Airport. We alluded to it earlier. That's also covered in your book. That's another scenario where a lot of people, in common with, I suppose, many of your witnesses, but a lot of people saw something that day. Tell me about it. And again, what's interesting is how the official answer was given to what it could be, which I've heard before, and it is very interesting. Tell us about that.
It's almost comical, don't you think?
Yes.
So anyway, what happened was, and this was in November of 2006. It was during afternoon rush hour, around 4:30 in the afternoon, over O'Hare, and this is one of the busiest airports in America. I mean, it's a huge airport, international airport. And all of a sudden, people on the ground started to observe this metallic-looking disc-shaped object hovering over gate C-17 at the United Airlines terminal. I mean, it was very specifically located. They started, people on the ground were the ones that were seeing it. The people loading cargo into planes, pilots that were sitting in planes on the ground, people that were moving planes around. And they started to talk about it on the radios to each other. They were leaning out their windows and looking up, and people were running outside. The manager, one particular United Airlines manager, went outside, and he was, there was a real buzz going on around this this sighting that was going on for about 7 or 8 minutes. We don't know exactly how long it lasted, but also a United Airlines manager called up the tower and asked if they were picking up anything. She said, the woman calls in and says there's a disc-like object hovering over the United Airlines terminal. And we have the tape, which is so fascinating. We have the tapes of those calls into the tower. And what's really amazing about them is that the guy receiving the calls was actually laughing and kind of making jokes and making fun of this woman who was trying to report a potential hazard. I mean, this thing floating up there. And she had to convince the guy that she wasn't drunk. She wasn't high. This shows you the pathetic attitudes that people have towards this subject here, even in an ongoing real-time sighting. When something dangerous is going on, they're still laughing about it. So that's a very interesting aspect of this case. But the bottom line is what happened was, after the object sat up there for a while, there was a cloud bank right above where it was hovering, and it just shot straight up through the cloud bank. It's very, very fast, and cut a very clear hole in the cloud bank, so you could see like a crisp cookie cutter-like hole, round hole in the bank where the object had shot through the clouds, and that's how it disappeared. We don't have any aircraft that we know of that can do something like that. So, of course, these United Airlines employees didn't talk about this. They were very clearly given the message indirectly not to. A couple of them ended up filing reports with an American research group called the UFO Reporting Center, the National UFO Reporting Center, because they just felt they needed to report this. I mean, there was the feeling that this was a safety hazard. And they just wanted to file a report, so they filed it with a civilian group. Eventually, the story landed with the Chicago Tribune, which is a major newspaper in Chicago, and appeared on the front page 2 months later, basically, after the reporter there did some investigations into it. And so it was a huge story. It got lots of hits and interest and everything. And in terms of the government response, there were approaches made to the FAA originally when the thing happened, and the FAA, their first response was, well, this was the airport lights reflecting off the bottom of the cloud bank, which is, of course, absurd in itself, but it's absurd even more so because the airport lights had not even been turned on yet because it was too early.
Yeah.
So that explanation was completely ridiculous. The eventual one that they landed on was that this was a weather phenomenon. And, they'll just want to say something to get rid of it. In this case, they said it was a weather phenomenon. And to end the story, I eventually called up the FAA to ask for further details about what this weather phenomenon was. What type of weather was it? And I had a feeling they were going to come up with the explanation of a hole punch cloud, which is a natural phenomenon where a hole is formed in a cloud when ice crystals fall from above a cloud to a lower cloud, and they melt a hole in it. It doesn't look like a crisp cookie cutter hole like we saw, but nonetheless, it's a hole in a cloud.
Yeah.
And it's bigger usually than the one at O'Hare. So I thought, okay, well, I'm going to check this out. And I called up a bunch of physicists and cloud experts and atmospheric weather experts and so on. And they all told me that for a hole punch cloud to exist, it has to be below freezing temperatures because you have to have these ice crystals. And so it turns out that the temperature at O'Hare that day, up where the object made the hole, was well above freezing. Therefore, again, physically impossible for that explanation to explain the event.
It doesn't hang together. Do you find, overseas, the officials are prepared, I think, to stand up and say, after a bit of investigation, we don't know what it was. But that doesn't seem to happen in the US, where you guys seem to, even when an answer is completely at contrast with the laws of nature and the laws of physics, it's still an answer is given, and then let's close the book and move on.
Exactly. It's exactly what happens. And yes, in Europe, they don't seem to mind saying, well, we've looked into this. Here's what happened. Here's the data, and we can't. That's it. We obviously can't explain what the thing was, but here's what we know about it. That's all that we're asking the United States to do. And as you said, there's this very bizarre way of handling it, even when it's a safety hazard, which is to just throw out an explanation whether it fits or not. And there's a stark contrast, and that's why in the book I find it interesting to draw the comparison between the O'Hare case and the English Channel case that I mentioned earlier, because they happen 6 months apart, but they are so drastically different in terms of the response that the two governments provided to the cases that it really illustrates the sort of bizarre way that the United States handles these cases.
Right. Again, and which case is that? Is that the Bentwater case? No.
The case of the English Channel, a pilot by the name of Ray Bowyer, who was flying for Aurigny Airlines in 2007. And I don't know if you remember, but it was covered on BBC. It got quite a lot of press after it happened. I think it was in May of 2007.
At the time, yes. Again, yeah.
At the time. And he was flying a small passenger plane over the English Channel when he saw these two gigantic objects that were picked up on radar, that were seen by another plane as well, and were seen by his passengers, and it was just he filed a report on it. He went,
as you say, he got support. Yeah, exactly.
Got support.
Completely different.
Completely different, and they only happened 6 months apart. So it sort of shows, even today. This is not an old problem. This problem is still going on in the United States today.
Okay, perfect, right. So again, you've got together a lot of these eyewitness accounts. These people have written it in their own words, etc. People who carry a lot of weight, I suppose, is the most colloquial way I can say to say it. It's interesting looking for kind of criticisms of the book. Again, part of my research, and I know you've already dealt with this because I read a response, but MSNBC, a journalist there, James Oberg, had taken issue with the book and had taken issue with the idea that pilots make good witnesses. His hypothesis, and again I've had a chance to read down through that, was that they're making split-second decisions, and it's not as credible a witness account as you would lead us to believe. How did you respond? How do you feel about that as a criticism of these eyewitness accounts?
Okay, well, there are situations where if there's a very fast-moving object coming towards the plane, the pilot's only impulse is going to be to get out of the way. And they're not going to have much time to look at the object. In those kinds of cases where there's only a very quick opportunity, yes, the pilot's number one response is to deal with the safety of the plane, and therefore they may not be a great witness in that situation. Those are the kinds of cases that Oberg was focused on, but the ones that they've written about in my book are situations where they're far enough away from the object that they have a long time to look at it. They're not having to dive to get out of the way or take the passengers' safety into account, and therefore, in those situations where they can actually really look, as far as I'm concerned, as far as other aviation authorities I've talked to are concerned, they make above average witnesses because pilots are trained to recognize all the different types of things in the sky. I mean, not only aircraft, but different kinds of bizarre weather things like ball lightning, and
that's
you know,
a very good. That's a very good point, because the pilots are seeing lots of stuff. I mean, it just stands to reason they're going to see, as you start to explain, there are all those listed things, a shopping list of things that are in the skies above us. So they know what to expect, and then when something appears that doesn't behave as everything else does, it stands out all the more. Because I mean, people on the ground, I've no experience. I could look up and I could see a weather balloon or a satellite, or Venus is one of the ones that's always kind of mentioned, and I could mistakenly assume that, well, there's something that's in the sky that shouldn't be there, but I'd be completely wrong.
Absolutely. Yeah, and if you're up in the sky, of course, you're closer, so you're going to have a better look that way, but you're also, again, a pilot and his crew are trained to, you know, recognize a weather balloon, recognize a satellite, recognize ball lightning or strange, you know, weather phenomenon, or particular, you know, military jets that might be being tested. You know, they're informed when there are things in the sky that are nearby. I mean, so I can, you know, and Dr. Richard Haynes, who has written a chapter about aviation safety for the book and has studied this for years and years and years to study aviation cases. He's a former senior scientist from NASA. He completely, you know, takes the position that they are far, way above average in terms of the witnessing, you know, the abilities they have to accurately report. They're also objective. They're used, you know, they're trained to deal with high stress situations and to stay level-headed. And, you know, they can very clearly see and make reports about what they're seeing. I mean, it only stands to reason that you'd have to consider them superb witnesses. Now, in a situation where their only focus is to get away from something, that's a different story. And, you know, that's what was so amusing to me about Oberg's criticism, is that none of the cases in this book that are featured, there's one smaller case which is like that Dr. Haynes writes about, but none of the cases that are featured in the book and that are described by the actual pilots that are written about, you know, by them, are that type of case. They're all cases in which the pilots had a lot of time to look. And so really his criticism doesn't even really apply to the book.
Doesn't apply. How many contributors are there to the book? How many different cases are covered in the book?
Oh gosh, I think there's 18 contributors. Now some of them, there's 18 of them, yeah.
You got to say, well, you know, even if you start, like on the law of averages, even if you start to dismiss a few cases, you know, you're still keeping, you know, 10 or 12, that it comes harder and harder at that level of people to dismiss everybody. I would say, I mean, I'm just coming at it mathematically. If you've got 18 eyewitness accounts from people who, and I mean, I've got the list of we'd say qualifications here in front of me, at that level, even if you can dismiss, I would say a third, it's a nice easy number, you still got 12 cases that it's going to be very hard to.
Yeah, and just to clarify, though, out of those 18 contributors, not all of them are eyewitnesses.
Okay,
they're not all eyewitnesses.
Right.
Yeah, it's a combination of actual official investigators and eyewitnesses. So
Gotcha.
Some of them, such as Nick Pope, who he headed up the UK's investigation for a number of years into UFOs. Some of the people like that are actually writing about more than one case, because they're writing about cases they've investigated as opposed to cases they've witnessed. So same for the general from Chile who wrote a chapter, General Ricardo Bermudez Swanheza from Chile, you know, writes about an absolutely extraordinary case that took place in 1989. And he's a general. He was involved with the investigation of the case, you know, but he wasn't a witness himself. So just to make that distinction, we have both types of people contributing to this book.
That is a good distinction, yeah, because some people, as you say, without ever seeing anything, it's still something, and I love this expression, I mean, it's just come across their desk as part of their work, and therefore they're worthwhile contributors, because what they have to say really pertains. In the
or they've actually personally investigated. You know, they've all had some kind of deeply personal relationship to the phenomenon on behalf of their governments. I mean, these are all people in official positions. But yeah, so they have a lot to contribute. It's not just the eyewitnesses.
And again, it does sound, as I say, from looking through even the reviews and stuff, it does seem to be really making waves. It seems to be really, because it seems to be getting people probably who wouldn't. I mean, this is a good book for somebody who's never probably read any of the UFO books out there, who could pick this one up and see a more journalistic, and I suppose skeptical, I used that word earlier, but I suppose in a fair way, it's kind of the tone I think that you're aiming for, because you're just getting these people to, as it was, state the facts, the old dragnet, state the facts, ma'am, and kind of everybody else
Right.
to take it from that. Tell me,
And I did write the book exactly like you said. It's written for the person who has never read a UFO book before and just needs to read one book and they're going to get the situation. And that's what this book is. That's what it's designed for.
and it's great because I mean the fact of the matter is, whether we even take any guesses, and we haven't, and you don't, and your contributors really don't, but before we even assume what might be behind it, the fact is it's happening. It's something that's here. Before we try and explain it, we should be looking at the fact that pilots are seeing things, people on the ground are seeing things, policemen are seeing things, people are seeing things, and that in itself is a worthwhile story because it should be taken seriously. And sadly, except for maybe different countries in the world, by and large it doesn't always get the sort of weight that it should. With regard to this story, how long will you stick with it? What's next for you? I mean, are you going to continue working on this story? Is there already something there that elsewise complete different subject that's making you kind of, it's pulling you in that direction? What's next for Leslie Kean?
Yeah. Well, thanks. No, I'm definitely still as involved with the subject as ever, and I don't plan to move on to something else. And really, what I'm, as well as just sort of getting the word out, which I'm doing a lot on the book, and the paperback just came out, so there's a kind of renewed level of interest in it.
Of course, yeah.
I've been involved with a documentary film for months and months, which is going to be aired on the History Channel in the United States on August 25th. I don't know how that plays out in Europe, but
we have the same channel. The air date will be something different, but yeah, it will be airing because we have the same. We've pretty much all the same channels and all the same shows. Usually it's slightly different. Like we have the Sci-Fi. You mentioned Sci-Fi Channel. We have that as well. Slightly different programming, but it's still the same. So whatever you're working on, it'll show up here probably. If yours on the 25th there, we probably have it about a week or two later, I think.
Okay. Well, I've been working on this documentary with the film company. I mean, it's not my film, but I had a major producing role in it, and I'm interviewed in it. And it's based on some of the cases in the book, and that's been taking up a lot of time since October when we started working on that. So I do hope people over there will get a chance to see it. It's called Secret Access UFOs on the Record.
Secret Access UFOs on the Record. And again, that comes back to your own, because that's the website we'll be directing people towards as well, isn't it?
Yeah, they sort of built it around the book and sort of my work. I'm one of the people that they've interviewed. But I think in terms of the future, I mean, as I mentioned briefly earlier, my goal is, I mean, you're right. What we've done in the book is sort of laid out the facts, but we don't yet know what these UFOs actually are. And so my goal is to really try, first of all, I want to change government policy, and I'm working on that behind the scenes in Washington, but it's extremely difficult given everything else that's on the plate of people in Washington, legitimately so. This is not high on the priority list. But nonetheless, I am building interest in it and, holding meetings and doing the kinds of things that hopefully will lead to some kind of change, even something simple like reporting forms for pilots. But ultimately, I'd like to see there be a small government agency set up like there is in other countries to deal with this issue. And that's sort of a long-term goal that I have, and I do discuss it in the book. But whether, I hope it's achievable, I'm not going to give up, just like I didn't give up on the NASA lawsuit thing. But we'll see where it plays out. I have to be realistic about it, but I'm still going to really keep working on that. And that takes a lot of time and energy in itself just to make these things happen in Washington. So that's sort of where I'm taking the issue from here, and to just really try to use the book as a tool for change, and also to interest the scientific community. I mean, as I sort of say at the end of the book, it's up to the scientific community to decide, hey, this is a real mystery here, like so many other mysteries that we work on in science. Let's pool our resources and try to figure out what the hell this mystery is all about. And once the scientific community becomes proactive and decides to take this issue on, I think we can really see some progress made, but they have to make that decision. They have to develop a methodology. They have to get over the stigma around it. They have to realize that it's a genuine mystery, that scientific methodology can be applied to it, and that they can try to solve the problem. And that's the other thing. And we've got the need for government involvement here in America. We also have the need for scientific involvement, and the two are very closely linked, of course. But, because the scientists need government grants. I mean, they need respectability from the government in order to do this. So, but I'm really trying to work within both of those communities to try, to bring about a shift so that ultimately, the ultimate goal, of course, is to get to the bottom of to find some way of proving beyond a shadow of a doubt to the satisfaction of all levels of society, of the status quo, what these UFOs actually are. I mean, are any of them extraterrestrial vehicles? Yeah. And that's the question we want to answer in the long term. So I'm sort of involved with the many steps that I think we have to take within the United States in order to make a shift happen in that direction, because the United States lags behind so many other countries, yet is absolutely essential, is needed in order to move forward. That's that's just the situation. We're not going to really have progress without the United States becoming more involved. And so I'm sort of very committed to trying to beat against that brick wall as hard as I can, as long as it takes to create some kind of shift.
It's
and
fantastic.
I think the book is a good tool for that use.
It's fantastic because, again, I love when our guests reflect like that, because you want to make an impact. I mean, an impact for good. I mean, you're telling these people stories, you're giving them a platform, but you want to take it a bit further, and you really do want to make an impact so that, socially it becomes more acceptable. Once the forms would be in place, once the government would be less likely to dismiss / ridicule witnesses or people, because again, the stigma, I mean, somebody coming forward, they're likely to get teased maybe by their social circle, but also they're probably going to get ridiculed at a higher level as well. So that's got to be something that needs to be done away with.
It's absolutely imperative. I mean, the stigma in Washington, Michael, is so intense. The people in Washington want just absolutely nothing to do with this, even if they personally believe that it's important.
Yeah.
I mean, there's just such a political liability for any politician to be associated with this. It's just a huge problem.
Tell me, in our closing minutes, we started off kind of on a personal foot. I want to bring it back to a kind of a personal question just before we leave you. You yourself, I mean, your work, you're writing, you're talking to people, you're piecing together clues. What do you enjoy most? I mean, do you enjoy that writing? Do you work through the midnight? Are you working furiously typing at 3 a.m.? Do you hate that, love it? Do you prefer talking to people? Or is it just the piecing together of the story in your mind? What do you really enjoy? Because it sounds like you're passionate. It sounds like you're having fun.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly, during the time I was writing the book, which was about 2 years, from the very beginning to the end, was the 3 a.m. typing kind of thing. Very, very much involved with the creative writing process, which is not easy. I mean, the numbers of drafts that I went through in this book, and the editing brilliant editing I got from the publisher and various other people. I mean, it's a very long, hard process to create a book like this. So I mean, that part is so difficult. Yes, I enjoy it. Sometimes you get on a roll and you just feel really great about it. Other times it's just plain hard work and you just want it to be over, And I was very thrilled, of course, when I finally done the book. And I enjoy talking about it like we are today. I just enjoy, carrying the message forward in whatever way it's needed. I really enjoy all aspects of it. But I have to say, writing the book was not always fun. That's
of course. But yeah, even carrying the message, because you were on the Colbert Report, which must have been, because I saw that. And,
that was a thrill.
Had to be fantastic. You came across really well. I mean, it's such a great platform. It's a funny show, but you do get your platform, and he's such a great performer, and it looked like so much fun to do that.
It really was. It was scary but thrilling, and I'm such a fan of his. I knew exactly what I was going to be up against.
Of course,
with him,
yeah.
So I was very well prepared.
Excellent.
And it was really, really fun. And you're right. I mean, he treated me the way he treats every other guest. He didn't particularly, come down on this subject any more than the other subject. And even though it's all done in this sort of comedic context, you get your message out.
Yeah.
And that's, he gives you the chance to get your message out. And I had a lot of fun. And I thought he was so funny in so many of the things he said. Were just so funny.
Yeah, I agree. I think he talked about what if they're Muslims, I think was one of his
exactly. Yeah, for your listeners, if they go to my website, the Colbert Report clip is right there on the homepage, so they can check it out.
We will, the links will go on our blog as well. This will be up on our blog, and people can follow on from there. The book, of course, where's Amazon? Is that the best place to go? Can they get it through your website? Where should people, if people are listening?
Yeah, I think Amazon's the easiest. If you go to my website, ufosontherecord.com, there is a link on that to our Amazon, Barnes & Nobles, all these different places that sell it online. But I don't know, Amazon, I like them because they always have a discount. The book just came out in paperback, so for people who want, the less expensive version of it, the paperback's beautiful.
Yep.
It's got all the glossy pictures and everything that the other book has. It's just a lot less expensive and
It's
easier to
always the
carry
way,
around. So,
much better.
you can. I recommend getting it on Amazon, but it's up to the person wherever they want to do it. But there is a link directly to it from my website. So
great. And again, you're on Facebook. I know that.
And I'm on Facebook, and we have
active. Fair play to you. You were in there.
Yeah, and I haven't been well, so I haven't been as active in the last month or so. But normally, there's a lot of activity on my Facebook page, and I really enjoy it. I mean, people writing from all over the world who have been reading the book, and we have really interesting discussions and questions, and so I welcome anybody who's interested in the book and is involved with it to come on the Facebook page. It's an open author page, so you don't have to be a friend or anything like that. And it's really fun interacting with people. I enjoy it tremendously.
Fabulous. Leslie Kean, a real pleasure. I have great respect for what you've done. As I say, I was reading reviews, and again, as I said, the phrase, this is a game changer, came up a couple of times. The very fact that in a genre that has been around for a long time, you really have done something different that seems like it's capable of getting a lot of respect. So you've earned our respect, certainly, for doing that. It's amazing work. Cannot wish you well heartily enough. Really, really have to wish you well with this amazing work. And a pleasure to
Thank
chat
you,
to you.
Michael.
And I hope we get you back. We'll cross paths again. I'm sure there'll be some reason to bring you back onto the Irish side of the moon. And I hope you're feeling better. I know you said that you've been feeling a little poorly. So I wish you the best in health as well as in work. A pleasure. Thank you, Leslie.
Thank you, Michael. I really enjoyed talking to you because you're so well informed about this, and you're very delightful to talk to. So thank you so much for having me on.
Lovely. I'll send the check is in the mail. Thank you for the comments. Pleasure. Okay. Take care. All the very best to you. Bye bye. That was Leslie Kean, and as I always say, a great pleasure, but I do mean it was a pleasure to speak to that lady. A fascinating journey that she has been on, fascinating journey that she is on. The book is UFOs, Generals, Pilots and Government Officials Go on the Record. Check it out at the website ufosontherecord.com, and you get information there about the contributors, the author herself, the book. There's a blog, there's a variety of things there, a couple of blurbs on the front page there. I'm going to just read them out very quickly. At last, a serious and thoughtful book about this controversial subject. Skeptics and true believers will find a treasure trove of insightful and eye-opening information. This book is bound to set the gold standard for UFO research. Another blurb here. Like me, Leslie Kean is an agnostic on the issue of UFOs. Her book is a fine piece of journalism, not about beliefs, but about facts. Kean presents the most accurate, most credible reports on UFOs you will ever find. She's fought long and hard to discover the facts and let the chips fall where they may. So again, UFOsontherecord.com will give you some information. And again, I've said before, I'm sure you're probably well practiced anyway, but Amazon.com or Amazon.co.uk, it's always worthwhile before you purchase anything. I do it myself. Check out the user reviews, what other readers are saying. I read those myself. I've written a few in my time. So yeah, check that out, and it will give you, as it did with me again, give you a very positive opinion on that particular book. And before we leave the book and move on to the last couple of things I want to mention this week, again, looking down through, I have it here in front of me, the shopping list of contributors. A major general in the French Air Force, a flight calibration inspection pilot, a fighter pilot in the Belgian Air Force, retired general of the Iranian Air Force, captain and pilot for the Aviation Army of Chile, former White House Chief of Staff, a general for the Chilean Air Force, pilot with the Portuguese Air Force, senior research scientist worked at NASA, a jet fighter pilot with the Peruvian Air Force, Brazilian 4-star brigadier general, an engineer at the French National Center for Space Studies, and the former governor of Arizona. That's, again, these people carry weight with them, I suppose, is probably the best way to put it. And that was Leslie Kean. I think we should reach out to that lady again. There's a few other things I would love to talk to her about maybe next year in some of our upcoming seasons. You can check out our previous seasons irishsideofthemoon.blogspot.com is a good place to go for the archive. Doing a slight bit of reorganisation there just to kind of group the guests more under topics, and I think removing some of the articles that really don't have anything to do with guests, and the tabs, or tags rather, topic tags is the best way to put it. So it should in the weeks ahead just become even clearer and easier to find not only guests by their names, which is nearly fully updated, but also to find them by topic, because that's a very handy way to search. It's how I search myself, it's how a lot of us search. So that's irishsideofthemoon.blogspot.com. We're also now archiving slowly, but we are starting for the first time to archive the shows on YouTube. So again, if you are going to just going to find it here, youtube.com, Irish Side of Moon. That's it, Irish Side of Moon. Same as our Twitter, because Twitter we had to omit the THE for reasons of length. Irish Side of Moon. We're on Twitter, we're on Facebook, of course. I'm always plugging the Facebook. Irish Side of the Moon with that THE before Moon is on Facebook.com. And 3 of the stories that have been most recently posted, just going to skim down through them in the closing minutes of this week's show. First one there, abandoning the gold standard was a fatal error we're now all paying for. That's from the Telegraph. Edmund Conway, again the full story linked from our Facebook. Briefly here, second paragraph, on 15th of August 71, Richard Nixon finally cut the link between the US dollar and gold. Until then, the US Treasury was duty bound to exchange an ounce of gold with central banks willing to pay them $35. Suddenly, for the first time in history, the level of the world's currencies depended not on the value of gold or some other tangible commodity, but on the amount of trust investors had in that currency. Central banks were allowed to set monetary policy based on their instincts rather than on the need to keep their currency in line with gold. That story goes on there, comments etc. at the bottom of that one. On our own page then, another financial based story, analysis of financial terrorism in America, and this particular one, David DeGraw, author, long piece here. This is a long piece, 4 parts, 13 sub parts within it. Again, just briefly give you a flavour for it, go to the abstract here at the top. Welcome to World War III, and continues, despite increasing personal financial hardship, most Americans remain unaware of the economic world war currently unfolding. An all-pervasive corporate and government propaganda campaign has effectively obscured this blatant reality. After extensive analysis, it is evident that World War III is a war between the richest 0.1% of the global population and 99.9% of humanity, or as I have called it, the economic elite versus the people. The following report is a statistical analysis of the systematic economic attacks against the American people. That's linked from our page again. It's on David DeGraw. It's 4 parts, as I say, 13 subparts. It's a lot of comments as well underneath that particular one. And moving down again, yes, this goes back, I suppose. This one is on EU Observer, and we've linked to them a couple of times before. Again, briefly jumping into the start of this, Lee Phillips, author, byline there, opening paragraphs. Title, Germany to propose unelected Stability Council for EU. Story, Germany has proposed the creation of a new EU overseer that would crack the whip and impose sanctions on countries that do not adhere to rigid budget discipline and pro-business labour policies. The idea, again, looking for the word here, it's further down, they're unelected. A Stability Council of unelected supervisors, and the reason that rings a bell with us is that way back, Irish Side of the Moon 11, we spoke with Jens Peter Bond, a member of the European Parliament from 79 to 2008 with regard to the Lisbon Treaty, and that was one of the concerns that gentleman raised with us, the idea of unelected people getting powerful positions behind closed doors and affecting the rest of us. That brings me to the end. Irish Side of the Moon, number 84. Thank you for your time. If you're downloaded, thank you for downloading. We are finished. If you're listening on any of the local radio stations or public radio stations, commercial-free stations, stay after the music, because we'll have archive material to bring us to the top of the hour. Bye-bye.
We are Irish Side of the Moon. Freedom of information. Personal empowerment. The Irish Side of the Moon.
I still have a dream.
This is just a ride. We can change it anytime we want. It's only a choice. No effort, no work, no job, no savings of money. A choice right now between fear and love.